Healthwise FAQ.
It's our Ebola special on Healthwise FAQ. Thanks for joining me, Daniel Martin. My guest, infectious disease specialist Dr. Leong Nam from the Rotary Clinic based at Mount Elizabeth Novena. Now, what we're hearing in the news today, this Wednesday morning in particular, is the issue of ethics and the ethics behind using some of these drugs, which are said to be experimental, unlicensed in some cases. For example, we know that Sierra Leone's Ministry of Health has written to the American manufacturer of ZMapp, the unlicensed serum that's being made in Liberia, being made available to certain individuals in Liberia, and they're saying that they want it too. We know that Canada is donating a small quantity of experimental Ebola vaccine to the WHO. Dr. Leong, a lot has been said about the ethics of using such unlicensed serums or drugs. What's your take on this?
Ebola is a frightening disease, and the thought that a treatment may be available for otherwise incurable, highly fatal disease is very attractive. But the question is, does the medicine work? As the word says, experimental. We are dealing with drugs which may work. And many drugs which have been deemed to be experimental and is proven sometimes in the lab does not translate into clinical efficacy. That is, the patients do not get better. In situations, it can actually harm the patient more. At the end of the day, we still need trials to show that they improve and they don't worsen. Daniel, I can tell you that chances are when the patients do fall sick in developed country like Singapore, United States, or Europe, the outcomes as a risk of death and the mortality rates will be much lower. But that's because of good medical care. You can certainly expect better care in Singapore than in West Africa. But is it because an experimental drug was added in, or simply because there was better care?
I see where you're coming from. So you're saying if this had taken place, if this outbreak had taken place in any other country, A, it might not have reached these numbers, and B, we might not be reaching this point of actually having to question whether or not there is an ethical consideration here. If it was in any other region, perhaps this might be the case.
Yes. So coming back, if we were to use an experimental drug and we see an improvement, it may not be attributable to the experimental drug, but it might just be attributable to better nursing care, better doctor care.
That's right. Okay, I see where you're coming from. So you see, isn't this a slippery slope in that sense? What if it does work for those certain individuals, and what if it does improve? I think the ethical dilemma everybody's wondering is, okay, will it be fast-tracked into the market and become the new vaccine that everyone's taking next year?
It will be fast-tracked, and in fact, there will be so much hype about it. When a person has Ebola, they will demand for this drug. Let me illustrate something else too. Years ago, in malaria, people thought that giving steroids together with malaria that involved the brain, or what we call cerebral malaria, will be very helpful, and theoretically it makes perfect sense. But when the trials were actually done, it showed that it worsened. By taking steroids, you had a worse outcome. So the same thing may apply to the experimental drugs. My point is this. I think it's good to have a drug, but at the end of the final statement is we still need trials. In between, even if you do not get the drug, or the drug becomes not available, we do not really know the efficacy.
And is it also true that, explain to my listeners, that when it comes to such experimental drugs or vaccines which are experimental, there's really very limited supply of them in some cases?
Yes, absolutely right. The companies are restricted in their production capabilities because they're only doing it for trials, and you're talking about 10, 20 people at a time. But with an outbreak involving thousands, and you need supplies to travel thousands of miles within a day, it is practically impossible.
Coming back to the issue of the importance of the quality of care, we did hear from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon talking about the important need to step up the global response to increase the amounts and quantities of protective gear, of things like isolation tents. Those are the aspects which are still more critical at this point. Is that correct?
Yes. To control the infection, to control the outbreak, the most and key important factor is prevention of transmission. Keeping the person isolated, isolation tents, keeping the person away from contact anybody else, that's the way to kill the virus and stop the epidemic. When hospitals must be ready for an influx of hundreds of people with very similar symptoms, and you cannot differentiate one from another. Okay? And when that happens, you have to isolate them and presume each of them has the disease. Screen it. If it turns out negative, he goes out, another person comes in. Then if you look at it, when was the last time you had fever, headache, and muscle aches?
Yeah, I can't recall actually. All three, definitely.
Yes, and if in the era of Ebola, and you come from an Ebola-infected area, you might be labeled as having Ebola when you don't, and you don't want to be housed in the same room as someone with Ebola.
Yeah.
So, which means that each one will be housed in their own individual rooms, and you can infer that there will be widespread panic, and everyone will be coming into the hospital to check.
So if anything is going to turn the tide, it's not going to be some magic bullet or experimental drug necessarily. It's really going to be the quality of care, in your opinion.
Absolutely. We will need isolation rooms. We will need isolation facilities. This will be temporary tents as well. And we will need a lot of staff to provide care for all these people. And eventually, we will win the fight against Ebola.
Infectious disease specialist Dr. Leong Ho Nam is from the Rofi Clinic at Mount Elizabeth Novena Specialist Centre. That's our Ebola special for today. Tune in next time, and you can listen online as well at our YouTube channel, Official 938 Live. Thanks for joining us on Healthwise FAQ.
Healthwise FAQ.